You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. On the 5th of November 2024, Americans will head to the polls to choose between US incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris or former US President Donald Trump, assuming he stays in the race. For a section of American society, the choice seems simple. For Trump supporters, Harris represents the liberal establishment, and for Harris supporters, Trump represents an existential threat to democracy. But for much of the rest of American society, the choice is much more complex than that. For Muslim and Arab communities in the US, concerns over rising Islamophobia, Biden's support for Israel's war, and fears of what either a Harris or Trump presidency could mean for them has left many concerned, conflicted, and troubled by the 2024 election. Helping us delve into this is Saher Selod. Saher Selod is a director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding and an associate professor and previous chair of the Department of Sociology at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. Her research expertise centers on the experience of Muslims with surveillance. In her first book, Forever Suspects, Racialization, Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, that was published with Rutgers University Press 2018, examines how Muslim men and Muslim women experience gendered forms of racialization through their hyper-surveillance because of the War on Terror. Her co-authored second book, A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and the 21st Century Racism, Polity Press 2024, that was published through, examines how the global war on terror has justified the detention, imprisonment, and hyper-surveillance of Muslims in the United States, the United Kingdom, India, and China. Professor Selod, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's our pleasure to have you on. Before we sort of get into the topic that we're going to be discussing, I want to discuss a little bit more about you. So you've done a lot of work around, things related to securitization, racialization, particularly of Muslim identities, and Muslims in the US and abroad. But what got you, especially in the post 9/11 environment, but what got you interested in that as a topic to begin with?
Yeah. So I started my PhD at Loyola University in Chicago shortly after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And, it was really through, what I was seeing in the Muslim community, their experiences, which, Muslims are very racially and ethnically diverse, especially in the United States. And so it wasn't that we weren't having experiences with racial discrimination in the United States prior to 9/11, but it was after 9/11 that I really noticed a distinct difference in the types of experiences with racial discrimination. And that was really, incited by one's religious identity. So I write about this in the introduction of my first book, Forever Suspect, where I talk about how the FBI, visited my father, for example, who was a very prominent Muslim American in his community in Texas, or how my mom, when she was wearing the hijab and driving her car to go get gas, was yelled at to go back home and things like that. That, certainly we had some experiences, but 9/11 really was a very, we really noticed the difference in what Muslims began to experience in that after that terrorist attack. So when I started graduate school, I was always interested in race in the United States. I was really wanting to do a study that helped us understand how Muslims were also experiencing racism in the United States. And so just to sort of note that the canon in sociology at the time really a lot of the work that was being done on race was about a Black and white population in the United States. And there was some stuff on immigration as well, and immigrant experiences. But religious identities and, how, somebody who has a Muslim identity could be experiencing racism was really something that wasn't explored fully in the, discipline, and it's particularly race scholarship. So that's where I really started from, was like, what's happening? How can we understand this from a racial framework, a racial, race theory, which is what I did in this first book, Forever Suspect. Yeah.
Before we sort of go further into that, when you were talking about the experience of your family and the sort of Islamophobic backlashes that they faced, what did those experiences do for you in terms of your relationship to American society as a whole?
Yeah. So on a very personal level, I was actually working at an independent paper at the time. So I wasn't in my PhD program yet. I was working at the Chicago Reader. And it was just a very interesting moment where I really hadn't quite thought about my American identity in this, on this level. I mean, I always got the question, where are you from? Because, of my skin tone. And then when I'd say I'm from Texas, I get, where are you really from? So people were really curious. This was different. This was a different moment where, my American identity was really put under a lot of scrutiny. And as I write about in the book, I was really trying to understand this. What's really happening here? Why is it that all of a sudden, I'm asked, where are you from? And then I have to clarify I was born in the United States, to feeling like I'm me, my family, my father, my community is seen as somehow a threat to this country. So, it was a very, it really marked a change in life for me in the United States from, I have a whole chapter in the book on flying while Muslim, like airport experiences, for example, that we just didn't experience that before. So, it really was something that I started to think about, like how much my American identity was really being questioned after 9/11, even though I was born in Kansas, raised in the United States, never lived anywhere else. So that really pushed me to study this and really understand what was happening in this country, that resulted in the experiences I was and my family and community were having.
It feels interesting because, of course, this seems to be not just your experience, but a lot of people who were around the US at the time, post 9/11, lots of people of Muslim extraction backgrounds, affiliation, as well as people who just looked it, had a very similar experience too. And we see sort of this radical shift in the way many choose to identify it post 9/11, which has its implication also on the politics, which we'll get to in a moment. But when you sort of talk about using racialized theories of within the sociology about racism, racial theories, how, for example, do we racialize the Muslim experience in a way, or using these frameworks to understand the Muslim experiences within America? Because, of course, there's always that retort, isn't there, that being black is part of it's your skin color, it's a race. Muslim is a religion, it's not a race. So how do we sort of racialize that? How do we understand that in that context?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it takes a little bit of rethinking about the definitions that we had. For me, in the book, the definitions that I was working with on race, which were reliant on pigmentation and things like skin tone. And just to be clear, in race theory, we know that, there is no quote unquote differences based on skin tone and pigmentation. There's a whole, body of literature that debunks scientific racism, that says there are any difference based on our, phenotypical differences. So, race is a socially constructed concept. So I'm really, I was really relying on that like definition that we've created this notion of race. We've created racial classifications. And, for Muslims, what I was finding is that it's this, tying to a religious identity, particularly a Muslim one, certain notions about them, that it's inherent in Muslim culture or the religion of Islam or anyone who's Muslim to sort of, be more prone towards violence, to be misogynistic, to be, for Muslim women, to be submissive, to be timid, to be oppressed. These are not new constructions, by the way. 9/11 did not create this. What happened after 9/11 is that we saw laws and policies sort of institutionalize these concepts that existed about Muslims. So the famous, academic Edward Said had been writing about the concept of Orientalism. And he was looking at it during this, for those who don't know, Orientalism is the notion that people who come from, quote unquote, the Arab world are inherently, misogynistic. They're unable to become modern. They're barbaric. They're violent. The same kinds of stereotypes that we see that have been applied to Muslims, and so, for Said, this was really creating a body of a knowledge that was created about the Arab world, which in turn justified colonialist practices. We need to go in and save the women. We need to go and democratize these countries that are inherently violent and, despotic and all kinds of things. And so this existed already. He shows that in his work. And what happened after 9/11 is that, there was this major terrorist attack. It was the perpetrators were Muslim, had Muslim identities. And it justifies putting into place all of these laws and policies, counterterrorism laws and policies that rely on the construction that Muslims are essentially potential terrorists. And so we're living with this still, I've been studying this for, I don't know, in grad school, but, as a professor, for over 12 years. And sadly, we still see, that anytime there's an incident, of violence that a Muslim might have been the perpetrator of, we can see the expansion of our counterterrorism laws and policies. And so 9/11, not only in the United States, shifted a lot of domestic laws and policies, not just counterterrorism. So this is very important, is that our counterterrorism laws and policies in the United States don't just impact Muslims. They have a much larger scope. So it impacts policing in this country. It impacts our border security, at the southern border and surveillance and things. But it also had, it impacted globally across the different countries. So we're seeing counterterrorism, which is the second book that I just published, looks at like how these counterterrorism laws and policies are actually global, and they rely on this notion of the social construction of Muslims as violent, barbaric, and misogynistic. So we're seeing this the same tropes coming back.
Well, I can sort of tell from this time period as well that it also, because many people sort of came up and this is their sort of coming of age moment where, they live in a post 9/11 world where suddenly Muslim identities are now suspect. And it sort of spurred, obviously there was initially fear in many of these communities and not just in the US, abroad as well. But it also inspired a new generation of Muslims who grew up in the US and the UK and elsewhere to go into politics, to take up actors and to organize. So in an interesting kind of way, on the one hand, you have this, incredible fear that something bad might happen, either from people within, everyday Americans taking, seeing a Muslim getting angry and doing something about it, or the government coming in and clamping down on you in some way. But we also see a lot of Muslims responding to this by going out and becoming active. And so this sort of interesting shift happens around this period. So could you perhaps talk to us about, you know, how many people, Muslims, became inspired by, not inspired, but decided to go out into the community, and how this sort of shifted the dynamics within Muslim communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so when I was interviewing people for my, what was my dissertation that became my first book, it was between 2009 and 2012. So a very different climate politically in the United States. Obama was president of the United States, Um, and the qualitative interviews that I did, like people were saying to me like, Muslims were fine, everything's fine. Like, kind of this, sort of, I wouldn't say it was a denial, but just, Muslims, I interviewed for that book, South Asian and Arab American Muslims. And in their minds, race was really a black and white phenomenon. We're not really experiencing these things, but then they'd start telling me all these stories of experiences that they had. So it was very different than what we're seeing, what you're asking about, what we're seeing with this younger generation today. And I really think at ISP, we do have some data that kind of explains this, like from our 2020 American Muslim poll, there's a data point that shows that 65% of American Muslims, supported Black Lives Matter, for example, right? So what happens is in 2016, you have a Republican candidate who's campaigning on such overt anti-Muslim rhetoric. He's talking about banning Muslims. He's talking about registering Muslims. The rhetoric was really overtly anti-Muslim, which we didn't see even with Bush, during 9/11. He even distinguished there are good Muslims and there are bad Muslims, and let's not confuse that there are lots of good Muslims in this country, even while he was putting into place some of, our counterterrorism policies that were negatively impacting Muslims in the United States. So you start to see, and there's a spike in hate crimes as Trump is campaigning on this, So we really started to see, a big spike in Muslims running for office, after this. Like 2018, we saw a ton of Muslims run for office, 2020, in 2022. And during the 2020 presidential election, a population that, was engaged became incredibly politically mobilized. So there was the Get Out the Vote campaign where we saw over 1 million Muslims vote. And so I think that, Muslims really started to get politically engaged and involved. They were always civically engaged. There's a difference here between running for office and like voting for, on the presidential, for a presidential election. But so they were always civically engaged. I think we saw them volunteering. Muslims have we know that Muslims are very charitable in this country. They're one of the most charitable religious groups, but we really saw the anti-Muslim sentiments, the spike in Islamophobia really mobilize this population to run for office, to get out and vote. So I think, and then, living in the United States between 2016 and 2020, there were tons of protests, that ranged from, stemming off of the Black Lives Matter movement prior to 2016, but then we saw the Women's March, we saw, immigration, people, protesting for immigrant rights. We saw, anti-gun violence, the climate, and then we actually, the most shocking to me was for somebody who studied counterterrorism laws and policies for as long as I have, and I've written books and things like, and articles, when Trump passed his executive order on the first Muslim ban right after he became president, really making good on his campaign promises. That was not shocking to me. People were texting me, "I'm so sorry, sir," non-Muslims. "I'm so sorry, sir." I'm like, "I've been studying this. This is not new." Like, all of these presidents have put in these, counterterrorism laws and policies. But what was shocking to me was that people showed up to protest it. Finally, so we're in a moment where we're coming off lots and lots of organizing and protests and movement building and coalition building, and this younger generation of Muslims have been a part of that, so you're right. It's a different population, it's a different climate, and a lot of it is tied to, the shifts socially and politically in this country.
Yes, it's really something to behold as well, because if we really think back, especially to pre 9/11 America, Muslims who are from a diasporic background, so South Asian or Middle Eastern, they were more likely to vote Republican, and they were a solid Republican bloc at one point. And this is distinguished from African American Muslims, who, of course, were not a solid Republican bloc. But we have also, the experience of post 9/11, and maybe that's part of the reason why Bush had to distinguish, because he had to understand a large chunk of his votes comes from those communities. And as we sort of get to, where we are today, where we have a very clear, solid block of Muslims voting Democrat or tend to be on the progressive side and so on, this is a big shift within the community. So that should be appreciated too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what we're seeing, we saw in, post 9/11, a real movement from Muslim voters from, really supporting more Democrats, Democratic candidates, at least on the presidential election. So we have, and then I think absolutely when Trump ran for office, a really large shift. So, we just collected some data on Muslims who are voting in swing states. We had a survey that we at ISPU that we did in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So 3 swing states. And the thing is that Muslims are such a small percentage of the overall American population. So, while there have been courting of Muslim votes, I think we're in a very unique moment, because in the 2020 election, 65% of Muslims in these 3 swing states voted for Joe Biden for president. And our survey showed that because it was conducted when he was still the candidate, that only 18% were planning to vote for him again. So it's a major drop in votes. And so some people might say, well, so what? That's Muslims are still like, a very, very small percentage of the US population. Does it really matter? Well, in Georgia, we know that Biden won by 12,000 votes, and there were 61,000 Muslim voters who went and showed up to vote. And in, Pennsylvania, he won by 81,000 votes, and there were 125,000 Muslims who voted. So you have Muslim voters concentrated in states that are really important right now for this election. So, we're seeing a definite shift in Muslim priorities, what matters to Muslims. They definitely, after the Republican Party, led by Trump, really relied on this anti-Muslim rhetoric in the 2016 election that pushed, they were already, I think, moving away from the Republican Party because of, the global war on terror, the rise in Islamophobia in the United States. But that really, that was a big shift when we saw 65% are coming out to vote for the Democratic candidate, and Muslims were organizing as well. They were campaigning. There was like I said before, there's a large get out the vote campaign. So right now we're in a very different moment, because I think Muslim voters feel like, they supported a presidential candidate who promised them that, Muslims and that what they cared about mattered. And then in this moment, post October 7th, they definitely have shown that they feel like their voice, that what matters to them was being ignored by our current president, Biden. So, as we've seen a lot of organizing in this country around Muslim voters, particularly, Palestinian-led, saying, you know, you need to pay attention to us because we came out and we supported you in 2020. And when, you won by such a narrow margin in these swing states, our vote matters. That's what we think.
Yes, that sort of leads into the next question, which is to do with how people are feeling. So let me ask you this then. So obviously we've got this election coming up in November, the 5th of November. And obviously now Biden is not going to be the candidate. It's going to be Kamala Harris. But you still have, the fact you still have, as far as we, at this moment in time for speaking, Trump is still running for president, assuming nothing else happens that pushes him out of the race. And so my sort of question would be this: what is the sort of conversation that is happening right now at this moment? What are people saying, especially among Muslims, about how they feel about this particular moment? I mean, you've mentioned, of course, when Joe Biden was still the candidate, his support had plummeted. That's the only word I can use for that. A dramatic drop in numbers of people who said they would willingly vote for him. But obviously now he's not the candidate. What is the sort of conversations people are having around that? And something else I would like to sort of perhaps reflect on a little bit is that it seems that in 2020, Trump's vote among Muslims increased a little bit. There was a slight shift in people voting for him. And although very tiny, there is still a Trump base among many Muslims. So what kind of conversations are happening there too?
Yeah. So I think the conversations with this shift and when Biden dropped out and Harris became the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, it's the same issues though for most Muslim voters. So what we found in this survey was that 61% of Muslims, their main issue was the war in Gaza. And this is unusual because if you look at the data prior to that, there was never one issue that Muslims aligned on by this much, 61%. It was the economy, and it was a much lower percentage, like in the 20s or something. So, 61% of Muslims said in this survey that we did in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan is that it is the war in Gaza. That is their main priority. So that priority has not changed with the candidate changing. I think what we're seeing is that Muslims are waiting. We're waiting to see how the Harris campaign would respond on this issue. How different, would she be than Biden has been on this issue? And I think, there is still time, but there have been some ups and downs with this, on the one hand, I know that, her tone is a little bit more, has been more, forceful on a ceasefire and that, she brought it up at the Democratic National Convention when she gave her speech that, what Palestinians are experiencing, there's a humanitarian crisis, this has to stop. On the other hand, there wasn't a Palestinian speaker that was allowed to talk on the stage, although, she did provide space at the Democratic National Convention for a forum on Palestinian human rights, which has never happened before, So I think, with Harris as the candidate, it's yet to be seen how will Muslims vote. Now, to your point, okay, so are they going to go Trump, which is something that people are like, are Muslims now going to move to Trump? And our data says no, that we're not seeing a massive shift from Muslims who voted for Biden are now going to go and vote for Trump. In fact, where we're seeing the shift is that they're talking about voting third party candidate or a write-in, or they're undecided. So, we saw that 30% of the voters that we surveyed said that they would vote third party when Biden was the candidate, and 17% were undecided. So that what we're calling these swing voters, we're saying these votes are still up for grabs. Trump is not proactively, his campaign, as far as we can see, is not trying to get these voters. There's some perhaps informal efforts being made that are loosely tied to the campaign. There's a Huffington Post article out there about some ads that have been run in, these swing states like Michigan, targeting these voters who don't want to vote for the Democratic candidate if they are not forceful on a ceasefire and an embargo on, military aid to Israel. And these ads are saying that, associating Harris standing with Israel and things like that. But the Harris campaign is actually making more of an effort, and definitely third party like Jill Stein seems like that's what's getting more support from the Muslim population than definitely the Trump campaign. So we're not seeing this, movement. And the reason is that one of the biggest issues based on the American Muslim poll that we've, done over the past, and also in this latest survey in the swing states, is that another main issue that Muslims have is Islamophobia and discrimination. And so the Council on American Islamic Relations put out a report, I think it was in December, showing the massive spike in reports of hate that Muslims were encountering, whether in the workforce, in schools, children being bullied, since October 7th, that it was like an incredible spike in this. So, these are issues that Muslims care about. They want to see something being done about their, the discrimination they encounter at work, or bullying of their kids in K through 12 schools, or student protesters who are being, expelled from schools and things like that. And they know that the Trump campaign, Trump, who, like I said, campaigned on banning Muslims and registering them and, all these things, is not going to be the candidate who's probably going to, do anything about these issues that matter to them. So we're really not seeing that they're moving towards this Republican Party under Trump, but they're undecided, a lot of them, because they feel like the Democratic Party has said things, when they're running for president, that appear to appeal to a Muslim population. But I think what we're also witnessing is that this population is actually some of these voters are saying words aren't enough. We want to see policy. We really want to see you move on policy, and not just say, that you care about Muslims and their civil rights and you care about Palestinian lives. I think we're seeing a shift from actually just nice words to demanding action and policy in this moment.
So you've obviously mentioned the sort of shift as well that happened after the 7th of October 2023. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about, since also, we've got the post 9/11 period, and then we've got 7th of October, just on a general level, social level, what are the sort of differences and similarities between the two periods? The aftermath of 7th of October, that we saw a spike in Islamophobia, but was there anything that was sort of different about it, and compared to, say, post 9/11? So what's your sort of assessment of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The major difference that I can say is that we've put into place, we're now October 7th. Now we have in this country all of these counterterrorism laws and policies that didn't exist pre 9/11. So 9/11 was really the moment that we started to see, we didn't have a Department of Homeland Security before 9/11. We didn't have the Transportation Security Administration. We didn't have a TSA. People, my students, were like, this is really wild that you didn't go through the security. You could just walk up to the gate and greet your family when they walked off of a plane. So we're now living under October 7th, a society that has, put into, like, we're living in a hyper surveillance society, really, where we have all kinds of surveillance tools, technology, but not only that, we have policy in place that, really, if you look at the counterterrorism laws and policies, there's a lot less accountability, when the government is, surveilling in the name of protecting the country from a foreign threat. That's very different than, a lot of the domestic policing in the United States. So, we have a lot in place right now that most people aren't aware of, because a lot of it is done under the radar and without this transparency and accountability. And so, now we have these definitions of what is considered terrorism. Terrorism, and there's a great book, Disciplining Terror, by Lisa Stepnitsky. I always refer to her work because she shows this history of, like, in the United States, of the studies of terrorism studies. And one of the things that we know is that terrorism is very loosely defined in the USA Patriot Act, which was passed very shortly after 9/11. And when you loosely define something, it becomes a lot easier to target a lot of different people under it, because it's so vague in its definition. So what constitutes terrorism, or who is a terrorist? The association of that is very loosely defined. So now we have all these policies and laws in place that can be used to, say, for example, if a university wants to associate pro-Palestinian protesters as supporting Hamas, which the government has labeled as a terrorist organization, there's a lot more that can be done now to those students in terms of policing, beyond expulsion. We're talking about now we can start to, can they be arrested? Can they be charged? Can they be, detained? All of these kinds of things. And so, we're just at the start of the semester for these universities in the United States. And these students who are protesting, how are the universities going to treat them? Are they going to start inviting, counterterrorism units onto their college campuses, which is dangerous for these, students, but also for a much larger population, your Black students, your undocumented students, So this didn't exist when 9/11 happened. The government was, scrambling to figure out, what to do. And, but in the 20 some years since 9/11, we funneled more and more money into the Department of Homeland Security, into our counterterrorism, policies and practices. We have fusion centers, which most people don't know what a fusion center is, but it was created after 9/11. It exists in cities like Boston, Austin, Los Angeles. And its whole point was, after 9/11, was to weed out any kind of terrorist activity occurring in these cities, right? And when they don't find terrorist activities, they use them for other purposes. Like, there's a report that came out of Rutgers on this, that these fusion centers are now being used to police Black and brown non-Muslim, communities. So, and even the question, will they be used in states that have banned abortion against women who are, seeking out abortion? So they get used, in these other ways when they're not finding what they were initially looking for, which is like terrorism. So that's a, long-winded answer to your question, that we should be very concerned when in this moment, people who are advocating for Palestinian rights, if they're going to be associated with advocating for any kind of terrorist organization. And we now in this country have the policing and surveillance, not only tools of technology, but we have the ability to really crack down on this in a different way than we did pre 9/11.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about, I believe it was New York University who recently declared that Zionism, being a Zionist, is now, a kind of protected characteristic in a way that if you block somebody from entering university as a Zionist, that's discrimination and so on. So we're sort of seeing that not only terrorism, but even civil rights, as the weaponization of civil rights ideas within university administrations as well, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is really something that we should be very concerned about because it is essentially going to have a chilling effect on speech, not academic speech for professors and faculty who perhaps, study states. Like a lot of us study states as institutions that wield power, and we're talking about state repression, right? Not religious, we're not targeting religious groups or, racial, any kind of racialized group, but so faculty, who are studying states and what are their practices and policies, but also students who are, demanding their administration to stop investing in supporting any kind of state that is committing acts of oppression against any populations within its border. So, this is something that, universities are, thankfully, I think there are other universities that are attempting to take a different approach, which is, I've been reading about just staying completely out of any kind of, politics, which is a little difficult, but I think that we need to be very, very aware of the impacts that this will have on speech, on college campuses and beyond, so this is something to pay attention to.
Of course, and there's also another, a different generational experience now, because when we spoke earlier about 9/11 and that being a coming of age moment in a kind of way for a lot of people, especially people of Muslim backgrounds in their relationship to America. Of course, now there's an entire generation, especially those who are at college now and have been at college for the last few years, who basically have no memory of 9/11 or the pre 9/11 world. And they're sort of gaining consciousness in the time of, obviously, we had COVID, we've had Black Lives Matter, but now we have October 7th. So what do you feel like, just on the generational level, you've people who are sort of Gen Z and so on, what would you say is the sort of generational differences in their experiences of these things and how they understand these things? Because for somebody who was in the line, there on 9/11 during that time, they have a memory they can fall back to and like, well, this reminds me of the post 9/11 atmosphere. But if you are a young person who wasn't around that during that time, you don't have that sort of memory to fall back on. So how do they experience it differently in a way?
Yeah. It's an interesting difference that you're kind of noting, that like for those of us who remember 9/11 and it was very, it had a strong, a real impact on our everyday lives. These, like I said, I remember flying and not having a problem flying, and now they've rolled out real IDs, which is a product of 9/11, to make it very difficult for people to fly without, in the United States, we will have to have a real ID, which requires you have a birth certificate and things like this to get that ID versus a driver's license in the security in airports. I think this generation, but they have, while 9/11 isn't something that they've experienced, they've grown up with sort of consequences and impacts of 9/11. And so they still, while they don't have that pre and post 9/11 experience, I think that, they are growing up in a society where the racialization of Muslims is very real for them. And I think, if I think about the interviews and even the family members that I have, who aren't race scholars, right? Like I'm studying this, so I understand it from undergrad to grad school. Their attitude was sort of, very much like, oh, this is not, they didn't understand their racialization right after 9/11. There was sort of like, this was a horrible event. Yeah, these things are happening. The FBI is coming to the mosque, but they didn't quite grasp it initially. I think that population, even the older generation, has grasped that now after Trump. But this younger Gen Z population is being raised in, with an understanding of their racialization from early on, because of, going to the airport, watching their mom or dad or themselves being stopped and searched, before they could get on an airplane. They are aware, they are living under these policies right now. So they're more aware of it. But I think the other thing is and it kind of goes back to what I said before, is they're also being raised in a time of a lot of social movements, with Black Lives Matter, understanding sort of police brutality and what, African Americans and Black Americans are experiencing when it comes to policing in this country. So, I think that, the rise and, sort of coalition building, movement building has a strong impact on Gen Z. And I also want to note that people have been advocating for Palestine for a long time. This is not new. Gen Z didn't invent it. Like there have been people who have been experiencing anti-Palestinian racism by getting denied tenure, losing jobs. There's been a real silencing around Palestine in this country. And so I think like this younger population is, has still, this that has existed prior to this moment of October 7th, but then also, being a generation that has social media and, different tools at their disposal that has, worked to help them like A, understand what's going on, but then B, also, it's a really great tool for mobilizing as well, so people are mobilizing. So I think that, in this moment, like while they're experiencing October 7th, while they see it, I think, maybe more millennials and Gen Z was still younger. Trump getting elected was another moment. So it wasn't just 9/11. There have been various moments in this country. There was I remember the Boston Marathon bombing. This was another moment. Anytime there's a terrorist attack, even if it's in Europe, Muslims here experience the consequences of that. There's a spike in all this. So there's a lot that's happened between 9/11 and now that Gen Z has certainly experienced. October 7th is a much more intense response by the government, by, universities and colleges, by, places of employment. But I think this generation is a different generation in that they're doing what we've seen in the past, which is organizing, mobilizing, and saying, no, we won't be silent. We won't be silent on this. And that coupled with the uncommitted that we're seeing as well right now, there's a lot of, just, it may seem like political disengagement, but it's actually quite the opposite. It's a real spike in political mobilization. It's demanding things of our government, in this moment. So I think it's quite an incredible moment. And I think we're really going to see, in the years to come, and even more, more Muslims being engaged, more Muslims running for office, more Muslims, whether it's the Democratic, under the Democratic Party, we'll see if it's the Republican Party, if they shift their tone, but perhaps even, a third party, like really investing in a long-term gain in this country in a third party. It's yet to be seen if we'll see in this, in this election, this presidential election, are people going to show up for Harris? Or are they going to show up for Jill Stein instead? And are they going to say like neither of these parties are meeting our our needs, so we'll start investing in a third party? Where it's yet to be seen, but I think we'll see more more investment, in it, and that's what we're seeing right now.
I think an interesting thing to think about as well is because obviously with October 7th and everything that happened after it, I mean, 9/11, we talk about the long shadow after it that it casts on everything. Um, and I think October 7th is now the new one where we think about what's the long shadow of that going to be. I mean, for many young Americans, they will remember the college campus protests and in some places the repression of those protests. And so my question here then is when we're thinking a little bit into the future, or a little bit further into the future, about the shadow of October 7th on the younger generations of Americans, what will that be? What will the relationship or attitude towards Israel and Palestine be going forward from what you can tell?
I mean, I think the shadow of October 7th is going to be massive on so many different levels. I mean, for one, as much as, the Muslim population is not getting what they're demanding through protests, whether it's through uncommitted or student protests in this moment. What they have gotten is awareness of what's happening in this region of the world, which most people, didn't even know, let alone major news media. The mainstream media is talking about it. I mean, granted, I don't think that, it's always being represented the way that the way and what's going on, but they're demanding that we talk about it. They're demanding that we say. So on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of, there's the potential for a lot of oppression and repression coming from the state through policing and surveillance. That's true, both in the United States and globally. I think this is not going to just be in the United States because of, the global counterterrorism policies that exist. On the other hand, we're seeing people talk about Gaza and Palestine in a way that we've never really seen in this country. If you look on Instagram, you can see the violence that has been ongoing since October 7th. We've never, even after 9/11 and the wars that the military invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not witness what that meant on children and men and women. We're seeing it today. So I think that that's huge in terms of, the ceasefire survey that ISPU conducted showed that it's not just Muslims who want a ceasefire. It's the majority of Democrats in this country who want a ceasefire. So that's non-Muslims, So we are seeing, and this has had a much larger impact on the way we talk about this region. I think for these students, it's, I think just like in, when we saw the anti-war, pro-peace movements, around the Vietnam War. Now, this is a little bit different because the United States was actually the one, engaged in that war, with troops on the ground in Vietnam versus this one where we're seeing the United States providing, selling the weapons that are being used against Palestinians. But a lot of those people went on to, serve and become our politicians and our leaders. So, I think that we're going to see that this has activated a Muslim population in a way that we're going to see them, I think we'll see the same trajectory of this has, really activated them, gotten them engaged, organizing student protests is, a skill set that they're going to realize that they have demonstrated, as they engage in their careers, moving forward. So I think we're going to see a lot more political engagement from this population. I think it's, the shadow of this is going to be that it's mobilized them in a way that is quite incredible. I think it didn't just come out of the blue. I think, like I said, the organizing, get out the vote, and the things that we saw, more advocacy organizations around Muslim rights, all of this, I think that, we'll see both the negative and the positive in the near future and moving forward, that that, Muslims have demonstrated that they have the ability to come together, particularly around Palestine. But, I think I'm hopeful that this is going to be a turning point where we're going to see much more Muslim activism and engagement and fighting for human rights and civil rights, not just for Muslims, hopefully, but for all racialized and marginalized groups as well. Yeah.
Indeed. And just sort of the last question, because we've spoken a little bit about what the future might be in terms of, October 7th and the communities, but thinking now about beyond this election, what are your sort of thoughts about what the future of America is going to be in the next year or two?
Yeah, that's a big good question. I think it will depend on obviously what happens with this election. It's a very big election, and the consequences are very real. I think the thing that we're seeing is that there's obviously a big difference between the two candidates, Trump and Harris, in terms of running. There are a lot of civil rights issues on the line right now with this election, and so it's really yet to be determined. While there's definitely the issue of the war in Gaza and Palestine, there's so many other there's so many rights at stake right now. LGBTQ, immigrant rights, surveillance, policing, all of these things, voting rights, education. So there's a lot. I do think, though, what we're starting to see, though, is that people are aware of the differences between the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate, but they're also noting where there may not be enough, differences in some areas. So, this is one of them. Our foreign policy, our issues on foreign policy, the ways in which we are treating this war in Gaza. These are some things that we might not see a major shift in, depending on who becomes president, but domestically there will be a lot. There will be a major difference in terms of who becomes president. But the one thing that I'll say is, like I said, between 2016 and 2020, I never, in my lifetime, I haven't seen as much organizing and mobilizing and protesting. And it seemed like every weekend after Trump became president, there was some organization trying to get people together to figure out how can we protect democracy, how can we protect civil rights. So, depending on who becomes president, I think we'll see a different shift in this country. Will we see more organizing, or will the organizing die down a little bit, if Harris becomes president? But I don't think that people will, sort of forget what's going on in Palestine and Gaza. I think this will be ongoing until we see a ceasefire and major policy shifts in the United States. So, it's to be determined. I think there's a lot at stake. So I'm sorry, I'm not answering it like concretely, but I think that there's a lot there's a lot on the line with this election, for sure.
Indeed, there is. Saher Selod, thank you for talking to that MEMO conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.